They laughed when a homeless army ranger inherited a crumbling mountain lodge in the middle of nowhere, until his dog tore open a wall and changed everything. The Greyhound didn't slow down for Harlan's Crossing, West Virginia. It just exhaled at the stop sign, let the door fold open, and waited exactly long enough for one man and one dog to step down before pulling back onto the highway like it had somewhere more important to be. Walter Cobb stood on the gravel shoulder and didn't look back. He was 53 years old, and he looked every bit of it. Maybe more. His face carried the kind of weathering that came not just from age but from altitude and wind and years, spent in places maps didn't bother to name. His beard was close-cropped and mostly gray. His jacket was military surplus, faded to a color that wasn't quite green and wasn't quite brown. He carried a single pack over one shoulder, the straps reinforced with zip ties where the original stitching had given out. Beside him, a German shepherd named Boone stepped onto the gravel and immediately began reading the air. Boone was 9 years old, which in K9 years put him well past his prime by the military's math. But nobody had told Boone that. He stood broad-chested and steady, his coat a deep sable broken by patches of rust and ash along his muzzle. He didn't bark at the new surroundings. He didn't pull. He simply stood and processed, ears rotating slowly, nose working in careful passes, like a soldier checking a perimeter before calling it clear. He never fully called anything clear. Walter adjusted his pack and looked down the road toward town. Harlan's Crossing was the kind of place that existed because it always had, not because anyone had decided it should. 2 streets, a diner, a feed store, a gas station with one working pump. The mountains pressed in from every direction, their ridgelines dark with spruce and fir, even in October, when everything lower down had already gone to rust and gold. The people noticed him before he reached the first building. A man in coveralls standing outside the feed store watched him the way people watch something they've already decided about. 2 women at the diner window paused their conversation. A teenage boy on a bicycle slowed down, looked at Boone, then at Walter, then pedaled harder. Walter kept walking. The diner was called Maze, though the sign had lost its apostrophe years ago and nobody had fixed it. Walter pushed through the door, and the bell overhead gave a dull, tired ring. The warmth inside hit him first. Wood stove in the corner, coffee on a burner that had been going since morning. The smell of it settled into his chest like something almost familiar. He took a stool at the counter. Boone folded himself neatly at his feet. The woman behind the counter was somewhere in her 60s. Short hair gone white at the temples, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, apron stained with something that might have been pie filling. Her name tag said Paulette. She set a mug in front of him without asking. "You're the one," she said. Walter wrapped both hands around the mug. "I guess so. The Aldrich place." She said it the way people say the name of something that has caused them trouble. "Came all the way from where?" "Pennsylvania," Walter said. It was partly true. Paulette poured her own coffee and leaned against the back counter. "You know what kind of shape that place is in?" "I've been told." "Told by who?" "A lawyer who's never been up there." She shook her head slowly. "Place hasn't had anybody in it since Earl Aldrich stopped being seen. That's going on 6 years now." "I know." She studied him the way people study something they're not sure they trust. Her eyes moved briefly to Boone, then back up. "That dog friendly?" Walter didn't look down. Friendlier than most people. A man at the far end of the counter snorted. It wasn't hostile, just the sound of someone who'd heard lines before. Paulette softened slightly. Set a small dish of water on the floor without comment. Boone didn't go for it immediately. He waited until Walter gave a slight nod, then drank with the same measured deliberateness with which he did everything. "What do you plan to do with it?" the man at the end asked. He was heavy-set, mid-50s, with the hands of someone who worked outside. "The lodge, I mean." "Haven't decided yet," Walter said. "Wanted to see it first." "Might want to reconsider seeing it," the man said, not unkindly. Nobody goes up that road anymore? Nobody? A pause. Something passed between the man and Paulette. Quick, almost imperceptible. The kind of look people trade when they've already agreed not to talk about something. Used to be hunters, Paulette said finally. Before what? Walter asked. She refilled his coffee even though he'd barely touched it. Before people started coming back with stories. Walter set the mug down slowly. What kind of stories? The man at the end stood up, dropped a few bills on the counter and pulled on his jacket. Kind that don't do anybody any good, he said. He nodded once at Walter, gave Boone a longer look, and walked out. Paulette watched the door close. Then she looked back at Walter. "You ex-military," she said. It wasn't a question. "Rangers," he said. She nodded like that explained something. Earl was too. Different branch, different era. But it was in him the same way. She paused. He was a careful man. Private. Kept notebooks. Kept everything. Walter felt something shift in his chest. Not surprise. Recognition. "You knew him well?" "Well enough," she said quietly. "Well enough to know he wasn't the kind of man who just stops being seen." She picked up a cloth and moved it across the counter in slow circles. "You be careful up there." Walter finished his coffee, left what he had in his jacket pocket on the counter, and stood. "Thank you, Paulette." She didn't say "you're welcome." She just watched him go. Outside, the air was colder than it had been. The sky had grayed over while he was inside, the mountains now just dark shapes against a lower ceiling. Boone fell into step beside him without being asked. They walked east, away from the buildings, toward the unmarked road that the county lawyer had described from memory because he couldn't find it on the map he was using. The road rose almost immediately, climbing through stands of second-growth timber that pressed close on both sides. The gravel gave way to packed dirt. The packed dirt gave way to something barely distinguishable from the forest floor. Walter didn't speak, neither did Boone. But about a mile in, Boone stopped. Not abruptly. He never did anything abruptly. He simply slowed, then halted, his body orienting toward something in the trees to the left. Not a sound Walter could hear, not a smell he could identify. Just something in the frequency of the woods that Boone was reading and Walter wasn't. "What is it?" Walter said, low. Boone stood motionless for another 10 seconds. Then he turned his head back toward the road and continued walking, but slightly closer to Walter now. Close enough that their pace matched in a way it hadn't before. Walter didn't ask again. The lodge appeared around a switchback like something that had given up on itself slowly, over a long time, without ever quite making the decision to fall. It was larger than Walter had expected from the description. 2 full stories, a wide covered porch that sagged at the far left corner, dormers in the roofline, a stone chimney that rose above everything and looked sturdier than the rest of the structure combined. But the windows were dark, several of them boarded from the outside, with wood that had warped and split in the mountain winters. Vines had climbed the north wall until they reached the eave. Gutters hung loose. The porch steps were half rotten, the wood gone soft and gray. Boone stopped again at the edge of the clearing. He didn't look at the building the way he looked at most things. His gaze moved over it in slow segments, like he was mapping it, assigning weight to each section. His ears were forward but not pinned. His posture was different, not alarmed, but charged, like a held breath. "Easy," Walter said quietly. He placed one hand briefly on Boone's shoulder. "We'll go slow." They crossed the clearing together. The front door wasn't locked. It had swelled in its frame and simply required force. Walter pressed his shoulder into it and it gave with a long, reluctant groan. The air inside came out to meet him. Cool, stale, undercut with something faint, old wood, mineral dust, and beneath that, so faint it might have been imagined, something metallic. He stood in the entry and let his eyes adjust. The lodge had a great room that ran the full width of the building. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall. River rock and mortar, built by someone who knew what they were doing, the mantel carved from a single timber. Furniture sat where it had always sat. 2 leather chairs darkened with age, a long table with 8 mismatched chairs, a standing lamp with a shade gone amber at the edges. Books were on shelves. A coffee cup sat on the table nearest the window, long emptied, a ring of old tannin still visible at the bottom. It wasn't abandoned. It was interrupted. Walter moved through the great room slowly, touching nothing. Boone stayed close, not at his heel but 2 steps behind and slightly to the left, tracking the room from a different angle. He moved like he was doing a different job than Walter, which he was. The kitchen was in better shape than the main room. The cold and the altitude had preserved it in a way that the more lived-in spaces hadn't. A cast-iron skillet still on the stove, a dish towel on a hook, a calendar on the wall still turned to February 6 years ago, the last week half filled with handwriting too small to read from across the room. Walter stepped closer and looked. The notes were brief. Times, initials, shorthand he recognized from a professional life. Not a social calendar, a schedule. He turned to Boone. "You smell anything in here?" Boone's nose was already working. He moved along the base of the cabinets, paused at a section of wall near the refrigerator, then backed away. One deliberate step back, then another. Walter watched him. "You don't like that wall." Boone turned and walked out of the kitchen. Walter took one more look at the calendar, then followed. Upstairs, the bedrooms were small and cold. One had been used as a study, a desk, a file cabinet with both drawers half open, a corkboard above the desk that still held pushpins but nothing else. Someone had taken whatever had been on the board. Recently, or carefully, or both. The only room that was closed was at the end of the hall. Boone stopped in front of it. The door looked like every other door, but along the bottom edge, new screws had been driven into the frame, 4 of them, steel, recently placed. The wood around them was brighter than the rest, unstained by age. Someone had sealed this door from the outside. Not long ago. Boone let out a single low sound, not quite a growl, more like a vibration. A held-tone warning that Walter had learned over 4 years of working alongside him meant one specific thing: pay attention. Walter crouched slightly and looked at the screws. He'd need a driver he didn't have. He straightened up, placed one hand flat on the door and held it there for a moment. Nothing moved. "Not tonight," he said. Boone held his position for a moment longer, then stepped back. He didn't stop watching the door. They slept in the great room. Walter on one of the leather chairs with his pack as a bolster. Boone on the floor beside him, close enough that Walter could feel the warmth radiating from the dog's coat. He didn't sleep deeply. He never had, not since coming back, but he rested in the way he'd learned to rest, alert at some baseline level, not actively afraid, just present. Sometime before dawn, Boone stood up. Walter was awake before the dog had finished rising. They both heard it at the same time, from somewhere below the floor. A sound so faint it might have been the building settling, except it wasn't. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Something below them, in a space that wasn't supposed to exist. Walter was on his feet. He moved through the great room toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. Boone went ahead of him this time, taking the lead with the quiet surety of an animal that trusted its own information. He led Walter past the utility room, past a back closet, to a section of wall beside the old stone fireplace where the paneling didn't quite match. Boone sat down in front of it. Walter put his hand on the paneling. It flexed slightly, not solid, not load-bearing. He pressed along the edge until he found the seam and worked his fingers into it. The panel had been fitted with care, painted over, designed to disappear. But Boone had found it anyway. Walter pulled. The panel came free with a soft pop, releasing a column of cool, pressurized air from behind it. The smell hit him immediately, dust and mineral oil and something else, something he recognized without being able to immediately name. Behind the panel, stairs. Narrow, cut stone, descending into darkness. Boone looked up at him. Walter exhaled slowly. "Of course," he said. He found a flashlight in his pack and swept the beam down the stairs. The walls were stone, fitted carefully, old but dry. The stairs descended maybe 15 feet and opened into a low ceilinged room. Not a cellar, too finished for that, too deliberate. He went down. Boone followed. The room held shelves along 3 walls. On those shelves, metal cases, the kind designed to survive temperature swings and rough handling. Green, serious. Walter's chest tightened before he'd even opened one. He crouched in front of the nearest case and worked the latches. They opened cleanly, well-maintained. Inside, folders, documents, printed photographs. A small hard drive in a padded sleeve. He picked up the first photograph. 3 men standing in front of a vehicle Walter recognized from a part of his life he'd mostly stopped looking at directly. He didn't recognize all the faces, but he recognized the posture, the gear, the flat expression of men operating somewhere that didn't officially exist. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in careful block letters, Bridge Hollow, Sept 04. Walter sat back on his heels. His mind went somewhere it didn't often go voluntarily. A briefing in a room with no windows. A mission report that was filed and then apparently unfiled. Men who went out and came back as numbers in a column that wasn't shared with the press or the families. He'd been on the edge of that operation, close enough to know the shape of it. Not close enough to know what was actually inside. His hands tightened around the photograph. Boone pressed against his side. Steady. Present. Walter blinked hard, focused on the cold weight of the dog against his ribs, the slow rise and fall of his breathing. He let that anchor him back to the room, the stone floor, the real air. "Okay," he said quietly. It wasn't for Boone. It was for himself. He opened the second case. Inside this one, a journal, hardbound, the cover dull green, the corners worn soft. Walter lifted it carefully, like he'd done this before. Like he knew what it meant to find something that someone had needed to hide. He opened it. The handwriting was small and controlled, the letters of a man who'd learned to write with discipline. The name on the inside front cover, Earl Aldrich. Walter stared at it for a long moment, his great uncle, a man he'd met exactly twice. A broad-shouldered man with a permanent squint who'd shaken Walter's hand at a family gathering when Walter was 19, and said nothing more memorable than "Keep your head down, son," in a tone that suggested it meant something specific. Then Earl Aldrich had disappeared into the life that people like him disappeared into. Then, eventually, out of it. Walter turned to the first entry. March 3rd, contacted again. "I told them the same thing I've told them twice already. The material isn't here. But they don't believe it because they know I know what it is. They're right that I know. They're wrong that I'd use it. I don't want to use it. I just don't want it to be gone." Walter read until the light from his flashlight began to feel insufficient. Then he carried 2 of the cases upstairs and read by the gray morning light coming through the boarded windows. By noon, he understood. Earl Aldrich had been present at something the government had spent 2 decades and considerable resources making officially not present. Not a massacre. Not a scandal in the dramatic sense. Something quieter and therefore worse. A program that had sent men into a situation they weren't told the truth about, and when things went wrong, had resolved the problem by removing the men from the record rather than from the danger. Some had come home, some had not. The ones who hadn't come home had families who were told things that weren't true. Earl had documented it, carefully, over years, names, dates, locations, cross-referenced records, photographs, a hard drive that he had kept updated by hand, adding new evidence each time he surfaced more. He'd hidden it here because this was the one place he owned that no one connected to him. Walter closed the journal. He sat for a long time in the silence of the lodge. Boone lay beside him, his chin on his paws, watching Walter's face. "You found it," Walter said eventually. "Not me. You." Boone's tail moved once, slow. "What do you think we do with it?" Boone didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just held Walter's gaze with the uncomplicated patience of an animal that had decided a long time ago that wherever Walter went, he would go too, and that this had never required explanation. Walter stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the mountain. The option existed. He was aware of it the way he was always aware of exits. Not planning to use them, just knowing where they were. He could walk out. He could leave the cases where they were, seal the panel back up, deed the property to a stranger through the lawyer, and go back to being invisible. It wouldn't be the first time he'd walked away from something because staying was complicated. But the names in that journal, some of them he knew, not personally, but by report, by the kind of institutional memory that former operators carried whether they wanted to or not. Names that had entered the record as MIA or KIA and then gone quiet. Families who had received folded flags and no further information. He thought about what it meant to let that stay buried. He turned away from the window. "We finish it," he said. Boone was already on his feet. Walter didn't know Harlan's Crossing well enough to know who to trust, so he started with the person who'd been most straightforward with him. Paulette. He walked back down the mountain road in the early afternoon and found her in Maze, wiping down the counter between the lunch rush and the dinner prep. She looked up when he came in. Her expression shifted. "You found something." It wasn't a question either. He sat down and told her enough. Not everything, not the details, just enough to explain why he needed a name. Someone who understood what certain kinds of records meant. Someone who'd dealt with government silence before and hadn't been bought off by it. Paulette set down her cloth. She thought for a moment. Then she went to the back and came out with a folded piece of paper and a pen and wrote a name and an address from memory. "Frances Howell," she said. "She's in Morgantown. Used to work for a veterans advocacy group before she started working for herself." She paused. "She's careful. That's why she's still standing." Walter looked at the paper. What happened to people who weren't careful? "They got quiet," Paulette said. "Like Earl." He nodded once, folded the paper, stood. "The people who came before," Paulette said. "The ones asking about the lodge. They'll come again when they hear you're here. I know. Then go today." She held his gaze. "While you still have a head start." He went that afternoon. The drive to Morgantown took 2 hours on roads that hadn't been maintained as thoroughly as they'd been planned. Boone rode in the passenger seat of the old truck Walter had found listed on a handwritten card at the gas station. A 1998 F-150 with a cracked dash and a heater that worked intermittently. But the engine was solid and the tires were new. It would do. He found Frances Howell's office above a hardware store on a side street. It smelled like paper and burned coffee and old ink from a printer that hadn't been replaced in a decade. The woman herself was perhaps 60, spare and deliberate, with reading glasses that she took off and put back on in the rhythm of someone who had learned to control a room through economy of movement. She looked at Walter and at Boone and at the case he was carrying, and she said, "Sit down, start at the beginning, skip nothing." He did. Frances Howell did not interrupt. She did not write things down. She listened with the full and narrow attention of a woman who had heard a great many things and had learned to recognize the weight of true ones. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Earl Aldrich contacted my organization once. About 8 years ago. He said he had documentation of a covered operation and wanted to know what could be done with it. We told him we needed to see it first." She paused. "He never followed up. I always thought they got to him before he could." "They got to him," Walter said. "He just hid it better than they thought." She looked at the case. "Everything's in there?" 2 cases. A journal, a hard drive. Frances removed her glasses and held them in both hands. "If this goes to the right places, and I know the right places, it can't be stopped. It will go too many directions at once." She looked at him steadily. "But the moment we start, you become a problem they need to solve." Walter thought a sealed door upstairs. The screws that were too new. They've already been in the lodge, he said. They didn't find the room. But they know I'm there now. Then we move tonight. She was organized in the way that people who have prepared for something specific are organized. She had protocols, contacts, redundant systems. A digital infrastructure built across years for exactly this kind of material. Walter watched her work with the focused efficiency of someone doing what they had trained to do, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't the only one in the room who understood what the mission cost. Boone stayed at the door. 2 hours in, Walter heard the sound before Francis did. He was on his feet before he could explain why. Someone outside. Francis didn't stop typing. How many? Walter looked at Boone. Boone was facing the stairwell, body angled, muscles engaged. 2, maybe 3. Give me 4 more minutes. You have 2. The footsteps on the stairs were controlled, not rushed, but not patient either. They weren't trying to hide now. They'd moved past that. The door opened and the man in the suit was there. Different suit from any Walter had imagined, but the same logic. Clean, expensive, quietly authoritative. 2 men behind him, not reaching for anything. Not yet. Mr. Cobb, the man said. Calm, almost friendly. You've had a busy few days. Walter didn't move from where he stood. So have you. The man looked around the room. At Francis. At the screens. At what was on them. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A micro-adjustment. The kind of recalibration that happened when a plan met reality. You understand what you're distributing, the man said. Not a question. I understand what was done, Walter said. Those files represent. Those files represent men who were written off, Walter said. And families who were lied to. That's what they represent. The man looked at him for a long moment. We can still resolve this quietly. No, Francis said from her desk without looking up. We can't. The man's eyes moved to her. Then back to Walter. Then to Boone. Boone had not moved from the door. He stood with the kind of absolute stillness that Walter had learned to understand as the highest level of alert. The state past growling, past warning, where the body simply waited for the command or the necessity, whichever came first. The man looked at the dog for just a moment too long. What's his name? The man asked. Boone, Walter said. The man nodded. Very slightly. He was military? We both were. The man looked at Walter one more time. Something passed across his face that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite concession. Something between them, complicated and unspoken. Then Francis said, "Done." The word dropped into the room like a stone into water. The man turned toward her. "It's out," she said. She leaned back in her chair and removed her glasses. 12 recipients. 4 journalists, 2 congressional offices, 3 veterans advocacy organizations, 1 federal prosecutor. The hard drive contents and the journal have been copied to secure servers in 2 different states. If any of them don't hear from me in 24 hours, they go public without waiting. The man was quiet. You came to stop something, Francis said. It's already stopped stopping. The room was absolutely silent. Then the man in the suit turned around and walked back out through the door. His 2 companions followed. Their footsteps went down the stairs, slow and controlled, and then the street door opened and closed, and they were gone. Walter exhaled. Boone crossed the room and pressed against his leg. Walter crouched down and put both hands on the dog's face, looking at him directly. We're done, he said quietly. Boone held his eyes. Steady, sure. We're done, Walter said again, like he was learning to believe it. He didn't go back to the lodge right away. He stayed in Morgantown for 3 days, while Francis worked through the responses that came in, hour after hour, from the people she had sent the files to. There were phone calls he sat nearby for without being part of them. There were reporters who came to the office, careful and serious, the kind who understood what they were handling. On the second day, a woman came who wasn't a reporter. She was in her early 40s. She sat across from Walter and told him that her father had been listed as missing in action in 2004, and that the family had spent 20 years not knowing. She had his name memorized. She said it the way people say the names of people they've lost, with the specific weight of something both kept and let go. Walter didn't say much. He listened. He was good at listening when it mattered. Boone sat beside her chair the entire time. He didn't seek her attention. He simply stayed close, in the way he stayed close to anyone who was carrying something heavy, as if proximity itself was a form of help. When the woman left, she stopped at the door and looked back. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't directed at the files. It wasn't directed at Francis. It was directed at Walter. He nodded once. He didn't know what to say, and so he said nothing, which turned out to be enough. He drove back to Harlan's Crossing on the 4th morning. The mountains looked different in the way that places looked different after you've been away from them. And returned, more real, somehow, and also smaller. The road up to the lodge was the same as it had always been, but his feet knew it now. The lodge was quiet, unchanged on the outside, still sagging at the left corner of the porch, still dark in most of its windows. But inside, when Walter walked through the door and stood in the great room, the weight that had been living in the air of the building was different, not gone. He didn't believe things like that entirely, but lighter. He stood at the fireplace and put one hand on the stone chimney, river rock fitted by someone who'd known what they were doing, built to last longer than anyone had planned for. He thought about Earl Aldrich, the man with the permanent squint and the grip that meant something, the man who had spent years building a record that no one was supposed to find and then died, or disappeared, or been made to disappear before anyone found it. Walter thought, you needed someone specific to find this. He didn't know if that was true, but he thought it. Boone moved beside him. He sat down in front of the fireplace and looked up at Walter with the uncomplicated patience that had gotten them both through things they hadn't thought they'd get through. His shoulder had been grazed in the second night. The one Walter didn't talk about, when the men had come back to the lodge and found it occupied and tried to fix that, and Boone had not allowed them to. There was a scar beneath the fur now, small and clean. Walter crouched beside him. He ran his hand over the scar gently. "It's over," Walter said. Boone leaned into his hand. "For real this time." Walter looked at the room around them. At the old furniture and the cold fireplace and the shelves of books no one had opened in 6 years. At the space where the hidden panel was, now permanently open, the staircase down to the empty room no longer a secret. Weeks passed, and the lodge filled differently than it ever had before. Veterans came first, a few at a time, then more. Some were from Earl's era, some were from Walter's. Some were younger, looking for something they couldn't yet name. They came because word had spread, the way true things spread, unevenly and through indirect channels, one person telling another that something had been found in the mountains of West Virginia, and that the man there would talk if you needed someone to talk to. Walter wasn't a counselor. He didn't present himself as one. He just kept the coffee on and the door open and let the lodge be what it turned out it needed to be. Frances Howell came once. She walked through every room, quietly, touching nothing, reading the space like she was doing the same thing Boone had done the first day, assigning weight, deciding what was real. She ended up at the great room window, looking out at the mountains. "He would have hated this," she said. "Earl?" Walter asked. "All the people." She said it with something like affection. "He was a private man. He kept records for 20 years, Walter said. "That's not a private act." Frances thought about that. "No," she said. "I suppose it's not." She left the next morning. Walter watched her car disappear down the mountain road and then turned back to the lodge. Boone stood on the porch beside him. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that came off the mountains with a clarity that made everything sharper, the tree line, the sky, the particular silence that lived at elevation. Walter breathed it in. "You did good," he said. Boone looked out at the mountains. His ears moved once, tracking something in the middle distance that Walter couldn't hear. Then settled. Walter put his hand on the dog's neck and held it there. He had spent 20 years being somewhere else in his head, partly. A portion of him had stayed behind in places he couldn't name to people he didn't know, caught in the particular stasis of men who come home and find that home has become a concept rather than a place. He had carried that like weight. He had carried Boone the same way, and let Boone carry him. Now the weight was still there, but its shape had changed. It had purpose in it now, the way scar tissue has purpose. Not decoration, not damage, but the body's answer to something that tried to break through. The families had names now. The names were attached to something true. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything he hadn't known he'd come here to find. He stayed. Not because the lodge was his now in any legal sense, that fully settled in his mind, but because the mission wasn't finished, not really. There were still names that needed to be spoken. Still families that hadn't heard yet. Still work to be done in the quiet way that Walter had always done his best work. Without announcement, without ceremony, one day at a time. And Boone was here, which had always been reason enough.